mid-60s, by the mid-60s, that has become huge. By this point, by 1966, the average National League game is drawing 46% more people than the average American League game. Okay, in 1967, the American League, without telling anybody, changes the way they report attendance. All of a sudden, they begin to report tickets sold rather than the turnstile count. The National League will remain with turnstile count until the early 90s. But the American League, they get a one-year benefit, and then the differential reestablishes itself up above 40% more people per game than the American League has. The National League is playing a more exciting brand of baseball. They are doing it in better, bigger cities, and they are increasingly, as the 60s go on and into the 70s, they are doing it in newer ballparks. So by now, after the 1962 expansion, this is what we have. And then depending on, this is the American League looking to close the attendance gap and hopefully get into the West Coast, which they do with the creation of the Angels. However, it does not really solve their problem. This is the attendance of those four expansion teams turning out through the decade, and there is a significant increase on the part of the National League. The American League gets into Southern California, which is good for them, but the National League gets back into New York, which is better. Houston is a much better market than, I don't know whether to count it as Minnesota or Washington, but the attendance gap gets even bigger. So now we come to Charles O. Finley and the role he's going to play for the American League in trying to close that gap. The American League had staved Charlie off. They didn't like Charlie. They wouldn't let him move to Dallas. They wouldn't let him move to Louisville. They required that he play out his lease on the stadium in Kansas City. But when he came to them and said, not that he wanted to move to the Midwest or the East or someplace like that, but when he said he wanted to move to the West Coast, all of a sudden they were willing to let him. And they did. So now we have a somewhat larger presence on the West Coast for the American League, although it still seems to me if you draw a line down the middle of the Midwest and then say through Tennessee and Kentucky, the National League has four franchises in the growing parts of the country to the west and the south. The American League has only two franchises there. So the National League is still leading the demographic war. And the Bay Area just does not work out for the American League the way they hoped. As you can see from this graph, the first 10 years the Giants were in San Francisco, they averaged 1.5 million people. The A's arrive, and the two teams together for the next decade average 1.6 million people, despite some really interesting and colorful and attractive A's teams in the early 70s. But they are still not gaining in attendance like they thought they would. Now, moving Charlie also causes other problems, some of which the American League anticipates. In the meeting, when they are pretty sure they're going to allow Charlie to move to the Bay Area, they also invite representatives of Kansas City. Kansas City, pretty much knowing that Charlie's going to go, has been making all kinds of noises. Senator Stuart Symington has been talking about the antitrust exemption. The mayors talked about trying to find a way to maybe sue the American League. So the American League, having watched the National League go through a fight over allowing the Braves to move from Milwaukee to Atlanta, decides it had better try and head this off. So it decides it will expand. One of the obvious places to expand to is Kansas City. And here, the American League is fortunate enough to do a pretty good job. Because of Charlie's antics in Kansas City, various groups had come forward there offering to try and buy Charlie out. Charlie was not willing to sell. So these groups didn't get anywhere, but they existed and they had put their finances together. They had a chance to do something for the future. The American League could basically call these groups in, interview them, and check their bona fides, their finances, and eventually decide on Ewing Kauffman, who would prove to be a very stable owner for the Royals for the next 20 years or so. But they had to go somewhere else. And where they chose to go was Seattle. This was deemed to be the most attractive market available on the West Coast. So they added Seattle while the National League grabbed another West Coast market as well as Montreal. But let's look at the numbers, okay? Here's the Kansas City area. San Diego, somewhat bigger. Seattle, bigger than that. And then Montreal, bigger than all of them. So you're talking about adding 4 million in population to the National League cities and 3 million in population to the American League cities. Again, the American League has not chosen particularly well, and it's about to get worse. Heading this effort is Joe Cronin, whom I've come to regard as kind of the absolute epitome of the Peter Principle. He was an all-star shortstop, a very good player. He was a decent manager for the Red Sox in the 30s and into the 40s. He was a rather poor general manager for the Red Sox in the 50s. And then he became what I would see as an absolute disaster as a league president in the 1960s. He was a hell of a nice guy too, which helped him. All right. So they decide they're going to Seattle. But unlike Kansas City, where they have groups coming forward, there was no obvious owner in Seattle. Cronin goes to Seattle, okay? And basically what he does is he taps into the old boys network. Dewey Soriano, who'd once been a Pacific Coast League pitcher, pitched in the lower minors, bought himself a small minor league club, built it up, got drafted by the Seattle Rainiers, drafted as an executive by the Seattle Rainiers. And through much of the 50s, he ran the Rainiers and then became president of the Pacific Coast League. So he was very well known and very well connected in baseball. His brother Max was also a big schoolboy pitcher in Seattle, as Dewey had been, but he decided to go to law school and became a fairly well-established marine lawyer in the Seattle area. So Joe Cronin goes to Seattle, and the people he knows are Dewey and Max, and so he starts talking to them and pretty much just says, you guys come up with the money and we'll give you the franchise. There's no betting, there's no vetting, there's coming up with the money. Well, the Sorianos have a little trouble coming up with the money. They can't do that. So they go to their buddy, Gabe Paul. Now, Paul at this point was basically running the Cleveland Indians. In 1964, the Indians had been thinking of moving to Seattle and had come there and had talks with Dewey and Max and struck up a friendship. So Dewey and Max now go to Gabe Paul and say, Gabe, we need the money. We need the money to put this franchise together. And Paul puts them together with William Daley. Daley had been the majority owner of the Indians until a few years before, and then had gotten out, sold to the Stofers. But he was now interested in getting back in. And they finally put together an ownership group, which looks like this. As you can see, Daley owns 47% of the team, the Sorianos 33 3/4, with various other interests. What the American League doesn't really seem to perceive is that it looks like this, with the out-of-towners owning 60% of the franchise, while the locals only own 40%. This had been a problem for the National League in Milwaukee. It was to prove to be a problem in Seattle. Now, the issue was, of course, that the Sorianos hadn't been able to tap into the big money that was available in Seattle. They had not really approached the people who owned Boeing or Weyerhaeuser or Nordstrom as examples of companies that were there that had substantial capital. And frankly, it was because the Sorianos were very small potatoes in Seattle, and they had kind of a chip on their shoulder about it. So they just said they didn't need to go to these big companies. They didn't really need to get hooked in with the downtown business community interests. And so they had to go out of town to get the money. Now, it was perceived at the time that the problem in Seattle was the stadium. Frankly, when the Indians had looked in 1964, they had balked because of the stadium. When Finley was considering moving to the West Coast, he liked Seattle better as a market than Oakland, but the ballpark was too poor for his taste, and Oakland had just finished building the Coliseum. So he went to Oakland. And everybody knew that this had been, when it was built in the late 1930s, it was a very good PCL ballpark, and people appreciated it. But it was now 30 years older. It was owned by the city. Maintenance had not been everything that it should have been to keep it going as a baseball stadium, and people knew there were problems. So when the American League agreed to let the franchise go to Seattle, they stipulated that Six Stadium, which is the name of the place, had to be upgraded to Major League standards. However, the American League never really specified in writing what Major League standards were. They said they wanted the stadium to be 30,000. When the costs came out, the city said no, so the target was lowered to 28. Then it was lowered to 25 and change, and in the end, it wouldn't really get anything above 22. So they began the work. There's now fighting between the city and the Sorianos. The city is not really committed to Major League Baseball. There are 5 people on the city council. 2 of them say they will never support any money going to the team to help redo the stadium or anything else. The others are varying degrees of support, but there's no real strong feeling either in the political elite or the business elite that they really want this or need this. So the city is reluctant to come forward with the money that was offered. The costs are, first of all, estimated to exceed what the city is willing to pay, and that proves to be true. The city is fighting with a contractor about what needs to be done. There is work that takes place. This is another view. You can kind of go back and forth looking at, like, say, right field bleachers. There are none in the minor league stadium. There's a rather extensive set built here, although you can see the upper 2/3 of them are not full. There are seats added in left field. The area far down the left field line is filled in, and bleachers on the other side of the fence are to be built. But on opening day, this is not really done. They think there were probably 18,000 seats on opening day, but other stuff had just not, this whole right field area had not been done. The concessions had not been finished. The bathrooms had not been finished. There were fences, wooden plywood-like fences that had holes in them that had to be fixed. And it was just kind of a minor league operation. It's interesting to me that Boughton hardly ever talks about the ballpark in Ball 4. He talks about his teammates and that stuff, but the ballpark really was not a major league quality ballpark at all. The pilots go out on a road trip in late April and come home to find that a lot of the new seats have been completed and has been given a paint job, but the painting hadn't been finished in time for it to dry. A lot of people get paint on their clothes, and the pilots have to pay, or the city has to pay. There's another fight about that to say who's going to do all the dry cleaning of the bills. And this goes on pretty much the whole year, with the city fighting the contractor fighting the city, the pilots fighting both of them. And of course, this is all in the newspapers, in addition to the fact that it's being reported that the pilots are charging the highest prices for tickets and concessions in the major leagues. This is not quite true, but it's pretty close. And the other part of this is that in coming to Seattle, the major leagues had required that the city agree to provide a real long-term solution, what eventually becomes the Kingdome, okay? And that the referendum to fund that had passed. But then almost immediately, a fight within the Seattle community began on the location of this ballpark. And this is dragging on and dragging on and it would go on for like 3 years. So all of the customers basically are told that our real ballpark is years away, and at the same time, as the pilots complain to the contractor in the city, they basically have to explain what they're complaining about. So the message that the local folks are getting is that this ballpark is kind of a dump. So you've got a dump now, a very vague future, and a bad baseball team. This is not conducive to a really good attendance record. And by June, the Sorianos have figured out that this is just not working, that they're going to lose too much money. So they begin to maneuver to try and figure out what to do. Their first thing is to go to Daley for more capital, because I don't have any. And Daley says, the way things are going, I'm not going to put any more capital into this. So at that point, the Sorianos go to the American League and say, we're going to need some money. The American League does not want to provide it, but they know they may have to. Eventually, the Sorianos begin talking about selling the franchise. It comes out in October. They make a deal with a bunch of people in Milwaukee, whom you will recognize as Bud Selig and his cronies. But this is not to be announced to the public. It's supposed to be kept quiet. Well, the word gets out around the Seattle business community, and some of the people who are interested, who maybe could have been recruited to the ownership group before the Sorianos took it, begin to put together a group to buy out the team. Their plan is predicated on selling an awful lot of season tickets, and they go to work on it and seem to be making progress when in early December of 1969, the Bank of California requires the Sorianos to pay back a loan for $3.5 million. Now, this is a franchise that had cost about $7 million to create, about $5 million to the other American League owners for the franchise and the players they bought, and a couple of million just in operating cost to get going. Now there's a loan for $3.5 million that's being called by the bank. And it turns out the American League knew nothing about this. They had not really investigated the Sorianos' financial structure. They didn't realize what was capitalized and what was loans. And so all of a sudden, this throws the whole thing up in the air. And the new Seattle group has to come up with an additional $3.5 million. And they say, there's no way we can do this. They drop out. Another overlapping somewhat Seattle group comes forward and proposes the idea of community ownership. The American League wants no part of community ownership. It is just, they say it's not in the baseball tradition. There's also a suspicion that the only community-owned big professional franchise in the United States at that point, and really still till today, is the Green Bay Packers. This gives the NFL problems because as a publicly owned corporation, the Green Bay Packers have to report all kinds of financial data to the federal regulators. And the baseball people do not want that kind of financial data for even one of their franchises being available to federal regulators and therefore to the public. So there's not going to be any community ownership in Seattle. By this point, it's getting to be the end of January, early February. Teams, including the pilots, are starting to go to spring training. And the American League dithers back and forth, trying to figure out what it's going to do. Eventually, in late February, they go to the Sorianos and say, okay, here's the deal. We're going to loan you $600,000, which we think is enough to get you to start the season, get going, start to get some ticket revenue, and that will carry you through the year. The Sorianos say, okay, and then they look at all their numbers and the numbers coming in and say, no, this is not going to work. So they go into bankruptcy court. We're now in the middle of March of 1970. All right. Now, the bankruptcy referee in that case has one duty. His duty is to get the most money that he possibly can to pay off as many of the team's creditors as he possibly can. This has nothing to do with the interests of the American League. It has nothing to do with the fans. It only has to do with the creditors. So he takes the best offer that's on the table, which happens to come from these guys. Edmund Fitzgerald is the big money guy, big in insurance and tech companies in Milwaukee. Selig is young and eager. He's put his share of the money in, but he's not the majority owner, but he does a lot of the work, a lot of the schmoozing, a lot of the real appealing to the other American League owners. And so they buy the team for $10.5 million out of bankruptcy court, and we have created the Milwaukee Brewers, who are still with us. So this is now what the map looks like. There are now only 2 American League franchises on the West Coast, as opposed to 3 for the National League. The American League has moved further back east. And of course, it's going to be facing a lawsuit from Seattle. Actually, not a lawsuit from Seattle, a lawsuit from Seattle, a lawsuit from King County, where Seattle is located, and a lawsuit from the state of Washington. So they set off to solve the problem. And frankly, the American League and Major League Baseball is interested in solving the problem as well. One of the key components here are the O'Brien brothers, one of whom, I think it was Eddie, is on the Seattle City Council, and he's appointed as the local liaison to Major League Baseball because of his supposed baseball connections. The other key guy is John Spellman, who becomes the head executive for King County and the person charged with building the new stadium. So Seattle has the hammer to hang over Major League Baseball's head and said, we don't really want to exercise this hammer. So you tell us what you really need. And baseball, the American League, comes to them and says, we need 2 things. We need we need to see that this stadium is at a minimum being built and preferably finished. And we need to find a stable ownership group in Seattle. So on the ownership group, they work back and forth. On the ballpark, Spellman pushes ahead with the money they got from the referendum back from 1968. And eventually it's built. And eventually an ownership group is found. Lester Smith is a what should I call him? I guess an entertainment executive based in Seattle. He owns a lot of radio stations. He owns recording studios. He owns a number of other businesses related to baseball, and he's become a partner with Danny Kaye. So together, they put together an ownership group. It's mostly them, and agree that they will own the Seattle Pilots. Kaye is a huge baseball fan when he was young, although he'd mostly been a Dodger fan in the intervening years. So by that point, they come together eventually in 1977 with the Mariners and the Blue Jays, where they stumble into a very good ownership group in Toronto. Toronto had very much wanted to join the National League and have a rivalry with Montreal. They thought they were going to be able to buy the Giants, who were in a parlous state in the early 1973-74 period. The Stoneham agrees to sell to Toronto. The city of San Francisco steps in, trying desperately to find a group to put together. Bob Lurie, who'd been on the board of the Giants, said, I'll buy 50%, but I'm not going to put all my money in to buy the whole thing. And the administration in San Francisco was stumbling around looking for somebody. And then in a story even Hollywood wouldn't believe, with less than 48 hours before the deadline hits and the team goes to Toronto, a guy named Bud Herseth calls from Arizona and says, he calls the mayor's office and said, I understand you're looking for somebody to invest in a baseball team. I'm willing to do that. Bud's a big cattle guy down in Arizona. They put him together. He hits it off with Lurie. They reach an agreement in which Herseth puts in 50% of the money, but Lurie gets to control the team. Lurie's very acceptable to the other National League owners. So all of a sudden, the Giants are snatched out from under the Toronto ownership group, which is very attractive. Labatt's Brewery, some of the big banks in Canada. And so when the American League goes looking for an attractive city, an attractive ownership group, the Blue Jays are there, ready to go. So anyway, I thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, and on the O'Malley book or about stumbling around the bases. Thank you very much.
Okay, Andy. I guess Peter has deputized me to do the question and answer. Everybody hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, John.
Okay, Andy, let me ask you a question about the relationship of the two leagues and Major League Baseball. It was different in the 70s, wasn't it, as compared to today?
Yes. Up until, I would say, even into the 80s, you had two separate leagues which cooperated only when they were absolutely forced to deal with issues related to the All-Star game or the World Series, or sometimes with expansion. But they often worked at cross purposes. For example, after the expansion of 61, 62, they jointly decided that, yes, they needed a more orderly process to do this. So they agreed that if anybody wanted to expand, if either league wanted to expand, they had to inform the other league at least a year in advance, and provide details about what they planned to do and things like that. Well, then when Kansas City blew up, the American League did none of that. And they just ignored each other. And that was fairly standard practice. They basically acted as rivals rather than cooperation. But I think one man changed all that. And that man was Marvin Miller. And all of a sudden, the owners recognized that their real interest was in dealing with Miller. And to do that, they had to cooperate. And so you had the creation at first of the Player Relations Committee, and then eventually, I think, of Major League Baseball, because they realized that their key problem was dealing with the players' union, not with the squabbles, often petty squabbles between the two leagues. So the whole structure of the game changed, and we now have MLB. The leagues basically don't exist anymore. They're labels that are useful for standings tables and all-star games and stuff like that. But in reality, I mean, there's no more league presidents. They have no real standing whatsoever.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Now, other questions?
Yeah, John.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, Andy, obviously, you don't think very much of the leadership of the American League. Was the leadership in the National League really that much better, or did they just luck out?
Well, yes, I think it was better, although not as much as the results would seem to show. I mean, I think Walter O'Malley was a much more effective leader than anybody in the American League. John Fetzer in Detroit was recognized as the most thoughtful and powerful leader in the American League, but he didn't really have the effect that O'Malley had in the National League. I mean, there's a wonderful anecdote that I've heard repeated. I'm not totally sure that it's true, but I think it reveals a greater truth. Supposedly, there's a National League owners meeting, which is just starting, and everybody comes in and sits down and looks at the agenda, and Phil Wrigley looks up and says, "Well, Walter, what do I think about this?" And a recognition that most of these guys are out, making chewing gum or brewing beer or something like that. And O'Malley is the one who's running the baseball business, and he's running it all the time and thinking about it and thinking ahead. So I don't think, I mean, some people like Bill Veeck tried to, portray him as all powerful. but I can't see that. There were too many things. He didn't want the amateur draft. He didn't want some of this expansion. So he lost out on those issues. So he was not all powerful, but I think he was more powerful than anybody else and more thoughtful than anybody else because he was concentrating on the business. Fetzer was very good on radio and television and really helped all of Major League Baseball on that as it emerged in the mid-60s. But also the American League had owners that we either like, Bill Veeck, or hate, Charlie Finley, who were just kind of disruptive, who were really focused on their own interests more than on the league-wide interests. And I think that inhibited what the American League could do. And Cronin was very poor. So I think it was a combination of factors, but luck clearly played a part too, Steve.
Now, does Warren Giles play a role here?
Not that I can tell. I think he was kind of one of your traditional league presidents. He ran the umpires. He handled some minor disputes. I don't see anything strong from the league presidents until Lee McPhail comes into the American League in the 70s. And all of a sudden, I found this in Bowie Kuhn's papers in the Hall of Fame. All of a sudden, the packets at the owners' meeting for the American League start to contain real information you'd want to use in making an expansion decision. You know, you have city population, you have metro area population, you have wealth estimates, you have transportation connections, you have all kinds of other economic measures that you would think the owners would want before they start making those kind of decisions. And that hadn't been present before. The National League papers are tied up, so you can't see them. But I think that's a sign of the maturity of the business, and especially the quality of Lee McPhail, who I think was a tremendous and unappreciated, really, executive.
Any other questions for Andy?
Yes, I have one. Actually, it's a two-parter, Andy. And by the way, thank you for a really interesting presentation.
Well, thank you.
First off, the 69 expansion with Seattle, and you pretty well described what a train wreck that was. I'm curious as to why Dallas wasn't a factor, and were there any other cities who were in position or competing to get that slot that wound up going to Seattle?
Dallas has fascinated me. I mean, it probably should have been included in the early 60s expansion. And then it was passed, Finley wanted to move there. He wasn't allowed, but that was probably because of Finley. But there were certainly other, there's all this talk regularly through the 60s because they still hadn't adjusted to the kind of demographic change that Steve talked about in his latest volume of Baseball. But Dallas was kind of consistently left out. They bid very hard, supposedly, to get the pilots when they went to Milwaukee. That didn't work out. I guess there were some kind of internal problems within the Texas group, but clearly it was a highly desirable market. And yet neither the National League nor the American League made their move until Bob Short moves the second edition of the Senators there in, 73, I guess, for the 73 season?
72, actually.
72, okay.
I grew up a Washington Senators fan, so that's stuck in my head.
Yeah, there's a lot of irritated people about there with Bob Short. One of the interesting anecdotes I didn't include in the presentation is when they were trying to find a partner for Bob Lurie in San Francisco before Bud Herseth stepped in. Lurie hooked up with Bob Short, and they went with this pairing to the National League. And the National League took one look at Bob Short and said, no, absolutely no way. We are not touching anything with that man in it. Especially, Lurie says, well, don't worry, I'll run the team. He won't have anything to do with it. Short says, no, that's not going to happen. I'm the experienced guy. I'm going to run the team. So that whole idea falls apart because of Bob Short. And they have to move on to another possibility. But yeah, I mean, Short at least recognized what was there. I mean, this whole pattern actually starts slightly before World War II, but definitely in the decade plus from the end of the war until the Dodgers and Giants move, that all of this dithering, they don't know what to do with all of these new markets. They don't know how to break up the, traditional 16 teams. There's talk of third leagues. There's talk of turning the PCL into a major league. There's talk of expansion in this way, expansion in that way, but they can't seem to make any decisions. And it's only when Stoneham and O'Malley grab the bull by the horns that anything begins to happen. So yeah, Dallas was always through the 60s. As I look back at that, I'm wondering, why do these people not recognize Dallas? So.
Jim, you had a second part of that question?
Yeah.
No, I asked both parts together. I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ed, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I was kind of curious how the American League managed the extra expansion when MLB went to 26 teams and the National League stayed at 12. Can you say anything about why they expanded and the National League didn't at that point?
The National League had not wanted to expand in 1969. They thought baseball had not really absorbed all of the changes of the 61-62 expansion. And they, in effect, got railroaded into it by the American League jumping ahead with its Kansas City problem and then creating the Seattle problem. So what happened, I think, was that Kansas City gives them a problem, which they solve by expansion. That if their failure in Seattle gives them a very similar problem. They're being sued by all of these entities in the Northwest. So, and their solution, once again, is going to be expansion. Obviously, one of them has to go back and satisfy Seattle. So they look for the other one and eventually find Toronto. But at the same time, the National League is still not happy with the absorption of the expansion teams from 1969. By the time they're making this decision in 75 and 76, the Royals in the American League are probably the only one of the 1969 expansion teams that are really putting a decent product on the field. The Expos are getting better. The Padres are not. The Brewers haven't really gotten good, although they would a few years later. But they aren't still really up to major league. They aren't even playing 500 ball in most cases. So the National League doesn't think expansion is a good idea at that point, and they stick to their guns, and they won't go for expansion for another 15 years after the Blue Jays and Mariners are created. And they didn't think it would work.
Any other questions? Andy, I'll get to, how about, let's talk about today.
Okay.
You got the Oakland situation, possibility of going to Las Vegas. There's some critics who say Las Vegas isn't necessarily going to be a successful baseball town. How do you read all that? You're out on the West Coast. Give us your interpretation of what's going on.
Oh, God. I hate predicting the future because I'm always wrong. I share the concerns about Las Vegas. They're going to build a park that's between 30 and 32,000, I understand. That just seems to me that the prices they would have to charge to make any money at 30 to 32,000 would just be outrageous. Now, maybe they're counting on a lot of the tickets being bought by out-of-towners who, have a chance to see their home team or their favorite team in someplace strange. But I just, and the financing there is supposedly in place, but as I read it, I'm not getting the feeling that it's in concrete, that, something couldn't happen. They couldn't back away from it. As usual in these cities, there are people who want it and people who don't want it. So I think there's still a possibility that that's all going to fall apart. But then God knows what's going to happen in Oakland. They've tried various possibilities there. They can't seem to reach an agreement. Frankly, as I watched this, there was a very interesting presentation by the Northern California people, a Zoom thing, earlier last week, and they had an author on who'd written a book about the whole Oakland thing, and he was not optimistic at all that something was going to happen. The tenor I'm getting out of all of those people in Oakland, including a couple of my family members, is that they want this guy Fisher to sell, is what it amounts to. And then they figure maybe there's enough of a clean slate that with Oakland or with somebody else, they could work something out. But clearly it's become a ballpark issue, as so many potential or real moves have been in the last 20 or 30 years.
It appears to be a bit of a mess. I watched the Giants
Yes.
in Oakland play today, and there was a whole bunch of people behind home plate with their cell T-shirts on.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, Fisher has really provided a focus for everybody's unhappiness, but that's not really a solution.
Right.
The solution is a stadium. The question is where. Is it somewhere else in the Bay Area? I mean, the population growth is all to the east and the south, and maybe there's room there for the team to move and relocate with a kind of a different center of gravity. But I haven't heard that being discussed.
Well, the Giants won't let them go to San Jose.
Well, there's places farther south than San Jose.
Okay.
The Giants have, I mean, the Haas family made a very, a generous but politically poor decision to make it clear that the Giants had the territorial rights to San Jose. And now the Giants won't give them back to the A's. And so, I mean, that's clearly a problem. But I mean, if you look at the geography of the Bay Area, it's in some ways similar to what we're seeing in Tampa, St. Pete. There's not really a good central geographic location for a ballpark. You've got the Giants in downtown San Francisco, but that means, you got to come up the peninsula, you got to cross one bridge or another, and bridges are always a choke point. Or you put it on the east side of the bay where Oakland is, and you've got the population base on the peninsula that finds it harder to get to Oakland. So I mean, I think that's a problem that may be. I mean, clearly from the graph I showed you in the mid 60s, the Bay Area was not ready for two Major League Baseball teams. They just didn't have enough people. I think they do now. But a lot of that growth is not really that accessible to the current stadium locations. The Giants have a new stadium and an interesting team. They seem to be doing okay. The A's have an entirely, different set of circumstances.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Yeah, I have one for Andy.
Dennis, go ahead, Dennis.
Can you talk a little bit about the crazy Washington, Minnesota move in '61? And there's another expansion team that ultimately didn't work. And then another one I was thinking of was the Tampa, Arizona choices, with Yale going to Tampa and NL going to Arizona. So kind of two questions there.
Yeah, I'll talk about the first one. The second one, I haven't really researched. I mean, I read it as a fan as it happened, but that was 30 years ago, and I'm not really enough up on that to talk about it. The 61 expansion, that to me was another example of the American League not quite getting it, and of a general baseball-wide tendency that, hey, there's only 8 of us in this case, or 10 of us in this room, and we don't want to do anything that would really go against the wishes of one of the other guys, because we might set a precedent that would come back to harm us. So you've got Calvin Griffith, who's taken over the team from his father, let's just say, Clark. And I guess, when did Clark die? Steve, you remember it's 56, 55, 56, Clark Griffith died. 55, thank you. Calvin comes in, and from the get-go, Calvin wants to get out of Washington. He doesn't like black people. The market's that's kind of small anyway. And he's going to the American League in 56 and especially in 57 and telling this to his fellow owners. They have just a knee-jerk reaction that Major League Baseball has to have a team in Washington, D.C. for political purposes. They can offer free box seats to anybody in Congress or the Senate that they want to impress. They can have the president throw out the first ball and get the publicity out of that. They just think there has to be a team in Washington. So they stymie Calvin until in 1959 and 60, as expansion approaches. And again, the American League is not really doing any serious thinking about expansion. As you read the stories through 1960, at every stage, you find that the National League has come to a consensus and a decision and started the process weeks or even months before the American League have. Everything they are doing is reactive, and in some cases, stupid. The National League, for example, announces that it's going to expand by 2 teams. This is in 1960. They're going to expand by 2 teams in 1962, which they do. The American League hears this, and Del Webb of the Yankees stands up and says, well, if they're going to expand by 2 teams in 62, we're going to expand by 2 teams in 1961, which at this point is like 3 or 4 months away. And oh, by the way, we might add 2 teams again a couple years further down the line. But they have not really been doing their homework. When the Continental League finally comes to when Major League Baseball finally agrees to do some serious negotiations with the Continental League, they have a big meeting in Chicago, and at the end of it, Ford Frick and especially Walter O'Malley stand up and said, all right, we've cut a deal. Here's what's going to happen. There's going to be expansion by 4 teams, and the ownership groups are going to come from the Continental League. This will calm all the Continental League people down and undercut Branch Rickey. And everybody nods their heads and says that's fine, except notably, neither Joe Cronin nor Del Webb says a word, because that's not what they're interested in. Their overwhelming desire at this point in 1960 is to get a franchise into Southern California. There is no Continental League group in the greater Los Angeles area. There's some talk of one, but they haven't really joined. They haven't put down their money. They haven't really gotten the group together. So that's been left out. That's kind of the general expansion process. At the same time, you've got Calvin kind of knocking at the door saying, hey, come on, let me get out of here. Let me go to Minnesota, which has all those nice white people. And the American League would like to accommodate him. Hey, he's one of us. He's one of our guys. So they finally reached this accommodation that Calvin will be allowed to leave if one of the expansion teams goes into Washington, D.C., where it will again face the smaller population and the poorer population problem that Griffith had been facing in Washington, D.C. Short goes in there, or eventually, it takes a while for Short to show up. But, they have a fairly stable ownership group throughout the 60s until those guys die. And then Short comes in. But it's not a particularly good market. That would, change over the decades, really. I mean, it was over 30 years between short taking the second Senators to Texas and the Nationals showing up. So I mean, there's compromises here. There's good old boy network kind of stuff here that really affected the quality of the decisions being made. Does that do it for you, Dennis?
Yeah, it almost seems like the American League whether they moved to franchise or expanded, they were solving a problem they had created for themselves more than the
Yes.
National League being strategic. And where they-
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this happens again and again. It happens in the instance we're talking about. It happens when they have to do something about Kansas City, and then they immediately repeat themselves by doing the same thing in Seattle.
Any other questions? Steve, go ahead.
Dave,
Andy, one more question about National League owners and the question of on the question of race and integration. Is there any sense among National League owners that we're getting the jump on the American League? We're providing a better quality of baseball to our fans by integrating quickly, or at least more quickly than the American League was?
well, they certainly felt they were providing a better quality of baseball. And, you know, they recognized that a lot of that was because of their stars, who were often black. Whether they were, I don't recall them actually explicitly kind of patting themselves on the back for, you know, being more forward looking than anybody else. I mean, they, you know, they had Rickey and then O'Malley and Stoneham in probably, you know, one of the more liberal cities in the United States, forging ahead. And that kind of forced everybody else to follow along. So, yeah, I mean, I think they were conscious that it was helping them, but again, I don't see them being willing to kind of take public credit for it.
Yeah. So there's no affirmative action in the National League.
No, there's just I mean, we give Branch Rickey a lot of credit for doing the big and the moral thing. But one of the interesting things to me is Rickey was quite explicit all of the time that he was doing this for business reasons.
Yeah.
He thought they could win. He thought this Robinson guy was really going to help them win. And then he gets campy and nuke them. So, I mean, I think the others, I don't see anybody in the ownership of that era, with the exception of Veeck, who has any kind of wokeness to him, so to speak. These guys were doing it because they thought it would make them money. And they were in the baseball business. And you did that by winning, and you won if you had better players.
Yeah.
So.
Any other questions? I have one last one. I told Andy I would definitely have an O'Malley question for him. Once the Dodgers went to LA, what was the relationship between the Dodgers, O'Malley, and Jackie Robinson? I understand that they didn't invite him to things until the very last, when he was practically dying. Is that true?
There was a very tense relationship. O'Malley did not particularly like Robinson. Robinson definitely did not like O'Malley. A lot of this simply went back to Rickey. Robinson was very grateful to Rickey for the opportunity he'd been given, and constantly showed that. O'Malley was trying to work his way out of the shadow of Branch Rickey in the baseball world, and also to change the way the Dodgers did business. You know, he was really trying to make it a more marketing oriented organization. I mean, he famously fined everybody in the office $1 every time Rickey's name was mentioned. Which of course seems very petty, and it is, but it also has the management function of reminding all of these people that, hey, we're doing things differently these days. So that was there from the beginning. In the early years in LA, there's a fair amount of sniping, especially on Robinson's part. One of the, I forget whether it was the NAACP or one of the other major African-American groups gave O'Malley an award for, racial doing good things. And Robinson thought that was just preposterous and said so in the newspapers. And so, there was this kind of sniping going on. I don't know that they didn't invite him because if they did, he probably wouldn't have come. What happened is that Peter O'Malley took the real initiative to mend the fences, working especially through Rachel Robinson. And he developed a very strong relationship with her. And she kind of worked on Jackie around the edges to the point where, yes, when he was very old, very close to death from diabetes mostly, they did get him to come. They did retire his number. The first time they'd retired he and Koufax and maybe Campanella, I guess, at the same ceremony in about 1972. And that was the first time he had really come back. But he never repaired his relationship with O'Malley, and O'Malley never really seemed to care. Peter, yes. Peter went out and worked hard to build those bridges, but Walter, no.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll turn it over to Peter to wrap it up. Peter?
Okay, Andy, great. This was wonderful. I'm glad I was here for it. I guess we're in August now. Downtown Baltimore, it's about to rain. We have an upcoming SABR event on August 26th. It's the game and the pregame party. So obviously those of you who live in the area, hopefully you can come. We're hoping to do a minor league game this year, like we have done in the past with the Philadelphia chapter, but appears somebody has dropped the ball. So it's highly unlikely we'll be doing a group chapter event in 2023. And for those of you who also live in the area, Orioles postseason tickets information should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So those of you who are season plan members will get information about how to purchase. There will not be tickets going on sale to the general public, from what I understand. So you either have to be a plan member or buy them secondhand. So obviously, when it comes to scheduling some of our calls and talked in October, we're going to wait until sort of the postseason picture becomes clearer before we schedule something and then have to cancel it. That's on the night of a game. I guess that's about it. A lot of familiar faces. So thank you guys again for coming after last week's snafu. We appreciate John doing his best. And he's a board member here at the Baltimore chapter and a great researcher and a good friend. So thank him for standing in.
Thanks, Peter.
And hopefully we'll see you at the next meeting at the end of August. So enjoy the rest of your summer, enjoy vacation. Don't know if anybody has kids, but I'm sure you want to get them out of the house soon and send them back to school. Appreciate it. For those of you who are out west, like Andy, stay cool. And I know SABR has not released anything on next year's convention, but I was told it'll probably be somewhere in the next 2 to 3 weeks. How true that is, I'm not sure. So have a good night, and we'll see you guys around here soon. And we appreciate your support and enjoy the rest of the season.
Andy.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Andy.
You now
Bye-bye.
know why Andy is the foremost expert on the business of baseball. Thank you.
Thank you, John.